In this video, we're going to look to recreate this xpFluidFX Granular solve. We're going to take our number 3, turn it into sand, and then have it fall away from the camera to form our number 2. So let's jump into Cinema 4D and get started. So here we are in our 4 crumble scene, and remember we've got this cached crumble revealing our 3. So what we need to do, obviously we'll be starting a new scene, but we need to just take some elements from this scene, and the only element we really need, what we could do is we could take this collider. So remember we had this collider object, this number 3, here it is here, 3 reveal, and it has a collider tag on, and we just used this to ensure that these blocks kind of fell forward and didn't fall back and intersect with that number. So what we're going to do is we're going to borrow this element. But in fact, what we're going to do, instead of it being positioned here behind our number 4 crumble, we actually want it to be positioned in the same place. And the way in which we'll get the transition to work is that we'll do it in the composition. So we will have the number 4 layer on top of the number 3 layer. So then when the number 4 layer moves away with the alpha channel, it reveals the number 3, and the number 3 will be sized correctly. It won't look like it's set back, because that's not what we want. And we may need to do a kind of a matte choker on the alpha of the 3, but that's a kind of a compositioning trick that we can address later. So what we need to do is basically position this number 3 so it is in the same position as our object number 4. So if we just go down to so we'll select our number 3 reveal mode text. Remember, it's 25 centimeters deep. So all we have to do to offset that and put it in the same position as all the other bits of text is we just need to put half of this 25. So let's put on the Z, we want to move it into the minus 12.5, which is half of 25. So let's just hit enter on that. And there, look, we can see it's exactly in the same position as our number 4 to 3 object. That's what we want. So what I will do is, actually, let's not do that in this scene. So I'll just hit Control Z to undo. We'll do that in our new scene because obviously we don't want to mess around with our saved number 4 to 3 crumble scene. So let's just hit Control C to copy that mode text object. We will go File New. Let's Control V to paste it in. And then we'll do that operation on the Z. We'll move it to the minus 12.5. Great, and I'll go to tags, Cinema 4D, protection, and now our number 3 is in exactly the right position. Fantastic. Right, so before we move forward, let's get saved up and create a new folder for this scene. So let's go to File, and we'll go Save As. Let's go to our libraries, and we've got MoGraph Countdown, and this is the one that we want. There we go. So let's make a new folder, and we'll call this one XP Countdown. Now this is going to be a big scene. This is probably the most complex scene. Well, it is the most complex scene that we have done because we need to do 2 transitions in one scene, and I'll explain why we have to do it a little bit later. But this is going to be a big one. So let's take this is number 3. We can put number 3 grains, but then it's also advection, and we're going to explode out those grains as well. So let's do that. Let's just put grains and advection, and let's just copy that. Okay, cool. Let's go into that folder. And let's just do a new folder for the cache. All right, and then let's go to our file name, paste in that name, and let's put a version number for our incremental saves. And then we'll hit save, and we're in business. Right, ready to go. Excellent. So let's just rename this. It's no longer number 3 reveal. It's 3, let's call it 3 grains. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill up the volume of this number 3 with grain particles. that will be granular, they'll act like sand, and we want them to fall. And it's actually a really simple technique, this. The result looks amazing, but the technique is incredibly simple. So let's get our number 3 and duplicate it, because we need to make a number 2 collider object. So let's change this, we'll rename it, and let's call it 2 collider. Just take off that protection tag. All right, so the number 2 collider wants this xParticles collider tag that we inherited from the last scene, and let's just put the bounce down and the friction up. But the number 3 grains, which we're going to use to produce our granular particles, doesn't need that collider, so we'll just get rid of that. All right, so the number 2, we need to go to the Object tab of the MoText object and change it from a 3 to a 2. There we go. And we need to set this one back. So let's do plus 12.5. And there we go. So it is perfectly back. Excellent. Looking good. We could, what we may do, I'm not going to do it now, but what we could do, we may just scale up this number 2 ever so slightly. So when we are in our final camera position and angle, the 2 is virtually the same size as this number 3, because at the moment, because of perspective, it looks like it's smaller. But we'll experiment with that a little bit later on. Excellent. So that's looking good. We have got our object that we're going to fill up with grains. We have got our collider object, which they're going to fall onto. So we're ready now to look at our xParticles simulation. So let's go to xParticles. We'll bring in a system, and we can just deactivate icon in viewport. So let's go to emitters and I'll create an emitter. And this emitter, let's call it emitter grains, and we'll go to the display tab and we'll change it from dots to circles filled. And a display mode that I like to do with this when working with grains is to go to the options here and activate ambient occlusion. So we don't want our particles to be spitting out of this square emitter. What we need to do is emit from our object. So let's go to the Object tab of the emitter. We'll change it from rectangle to object. Let's drag in our 3 grains, and then what we want to do is emit from, well, it's kind of like a shot mode where we're going to emit from the very first frame, but instead of shot, we will pick our 2 kind of fluids emission types. So there's regular and hexagonal. We're going to pick hexagonal. We don't want to emit every frame, so let's deselect this, and then let's say the end frame is 1, so it's just going to shoot out on 1 frame, and we can take away all the speed. So now what's going to happen is, if we make our 2, let's make our 2 letters invisible. Now what's going to happen is our particles are spawned in an hexagonal grid, and what the emitter does, it looks at the radius and then it puts the particles in an hexagonal grid within the volume of our object, and the particles aren't allowed to intersect, and it fits as many in as it possibly can. So on 3 centimeters, let's just see how many that is. We'll go to the display tab. Let's go to HUD. We can show HUD, and look, we've got 797 particles. We're going to want more than that. Let's put it down to, say, 1.5. So you can see it has a huge effect. Now we've got 6,445 particles. We're going to go even lower than this when we get down to what we're going to be caching. But just to talk you through the granular settings, we'll keep it at that resolution. Excellent. All right, so what do we need to do? Well, we need this to behave like grains. So to do that, we need a dynamics object, and it's our FluidFX. So let's bring in FluidFX, and we'll leave everything as default for now. Where we actually make this a granular solve rather than a liquid solve is not in the FluidFX settings, it's in the emitter settings. So if we go to the emitter, let's go to the extended data tab, fluid data, and look, we have a fluid type pull down. By default, it's on liquid. If we put this onto granular, you will see that these areas get grayed out, and we open up these new settings. So let's change it to granular. And now we have got our granular settings. And there's only 3: friction, stability, and cohesion. But these have a massive, massive impact on the look and feel of our granular sim. And each setting, if you make a change in friction, for example, it also has a knock-on effect to stability and cohesion. So these are, although they are separate parameters, they have a massive effect on each other should you make any changes. And we'll go through those in a minute. But if we hit play, nothing happens because there are no forces in our scene. So our particles have just been born and they're just sitting there. So what we need to do is we need to move them, and what we want is we want them to fall back from their birth position so they land on our 2 collider. So to do that, we're just going to use a gravity, and we'll just change the direction of the force. So if we go to motion modifiers and bring in a gravity, here we've got our gravity. You can see obviously it's going to be pulling objects downwards. So let's just hit R for the rotate tool, hold shift, and we'll just put that to 90 degrees. And now it's pointing back in the plus Z. So let's make that invisible. And there we go. So now look, we're kind of getting the look. Now we've got our grains falling and colliding onto our number 2. And then the rest are falling into the background. So when it comes to render time, we're going to fade away these falling particles with a rendering technique. But there is no point in us having all of these wasted particles being calculated in our scene. It's just wasted calculation. So let's kill them off once they've fallen back a certain distance. So we'll go to modifiers, we'll bring in a control mod, and it's going to be an XP kill. And that brings in our yellow bounding box. And what this is saying is whenever particles fall outside of this volume, they'll be killed. So if I go forward a frame, look, they've all disappeared. And if we go from the beginning again, you'll see they fall away, but then they start disappearing as they fall outside of that kill. Excellent. And we may, when it comes to cache time, we might make a few adjustments to that kill, but for the time being, let's just make it invisible. And let's just dolly in a bit. Right, so we're getting the look that we want, but obviously it doesn't look right yet at all, does it? So all of these grains look like they're just behaving as individual grains, like very dry sand or like salt, and they're just all pouring away and they're just all flowing. We're not getting any of those nice clumps that we need. So how are we going to go about getting those? Well, let's just, in my mission tab, look, let's reduce our speed, let's reduce our radius amount to say 1.2, so we've got even more particles in our scene. Now we've got 13,000, and we're looking closer to a kind of a particle resolution that we'll want at the end. So let's hit play. Okay, so how are we going to make this look more clumpy? Well, what we need to do is introduce, for a start, lots more friction between these granular particles. So let's go to my emitter grains, to our extended data, and look, we've got a friction slider. Now, friction is what you would imagine. It is the amount of friction between 2 granular particles. So if we increase this, it should be more difficult for those particles to move quickly. So let's have a look. Well, it's kind of made a slight change, but actually underwhelmingly so. It looks pretty similar, but you can see there is a little bit of clumping now. And the reason we haven't had much of a change is we need to go back to our FluidFX settings and remind ourselves about this accuracy. So by default, we have this fast accuracy preset, and that means that the solver isn't using many steps per frame or many iterations per frame. And what granular solves need, they need to get that nice kind of stiffness of friction, they need much more iterations than the standard, and that is just a bullet that you have to bite when doing granular solves. So if I change this accuracy from fast to say high, under the hood we've got loads more steps and therefore loads more iterations per frame, and you will see that this will have stiffened up this sim somewhat. And look, straight away, look, we've got clumps now. and we've got things breaking off. So that's looking far more like the animation that we want. So with grains, you are going to have to very quickly move away from the fast accuracy setting, and look, you need to go up to this high amount. Okay, so at this point, before we go into the granular settings in a little bit more depth, what would be nice if we can sort out this display mode. At the moment, every particle is just the same green color, and the only reason we can kind of differentiate is because of the viewport ambient occlusion that we've put on. So in our render, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be applying a gradient to these particles. So let's just do that now, and it's going to make it easier for us to look at the fluid effects and look how the granular settings work and make the adjustments that are required. So to change the color of particles, what we're going to do is use a modifier. So if you go to the modifier, let's go to the control modifiers and let's pick a xp color. There you are. And if we just hit play, by default, the modifier takes over the color and it changes them all white, and that's because we have the color operation set to set color immediate, and the color is just this white color. That's not what we want. We want to change this from set color to gradient by parameter. So now if we put that, look, we've got this default blue to white gradient, and if we hit play, the parameter by default is set to age. So what this is saying is, as the particles get older, they're moving along this gradient and their colour is being changed from blue to white. And we can see that happening. But that isn't what we want. We don't want it by age. We want to set a gradient by its position in Z space. So we're going to go to gradient parameter and change it from age to 3D linear. And now if I hit play, you'll see that most of those particles look like they're just this blue color. And that's because, well, the mode is set to happen across the y-axis. And you can see, look, you see the top ones are slightly lighter blue than the bottom ones. So we've got it to set over the y-axis. The start of the gradient, the blue color, is going to be at world 0. Look, axis min 0 centimeters, so that's there. And the maximum, the white, is going to be 500 centimeters, which is, well, 500 centimeters, look, it's way up here. So what we need to do is change this. We don't want it to be the Y, we want it to be going on the Z. And the axis min is the position of our number 3. So let's just have a look. So it's minus 12.5 in the Z. Look, this position here. So let's go back to the colour, and in the min, let's put minus 12.5, and in the max, let's put 12.5, because it's 25 centimetres deep. So now if we hit play, yes, look, that's what we want. We've got a gradient going back from blue to white. Fantastic. But as these particles fall, they're going to move outside of this amount. Look, and they're all, as they fall back, they're all gradually turning white. That's not what we want. We want them to hold their colour. So let's just check on this. Look, change on birth only. So now it's just going to change it once, and now it'll keep its colour as it falls through. This is exactly what we want. We're starting to, you can start to see the effect is beginning to work now that we've got that colour sorted. Great. So the next thing we want to do is, let's just make our number 2 visible. Now, we have a certain portions of this number 3 have no geometry behind them. This bit here, for example. So it's just going to fall back immediately into the ether. What would be nice if we could slightly resize and reposition our 2 to give more of an underlying platform for these grain particles on top. So let's just, and we're just going to eyeball this. So let's go with the 2, and let's just increase the height slightly. And then we're going to have to just increase. There we go. Just move it a little bit. And that's looking better. So now there's just a little bit more of a platform for our particles to interact with. And we've done it subtly enough that the position and scale change isn't going to be noticeable, especially because the 2 is further back in the scene, so perspective is making it look smaller. So that's looking pretty decent. We're starting to get this look that we require. Right, so let's now explore further the various different fluid effects and emitter granular settings and some other friction settings to try and make adjustments to get this to look how we want it. So let's go to our, let's just hit play. We'll get to our point. All right. So if we go to our emitter, well, first of all, let's talk about friction. If you look in our simulation, you can see that the particles are sliding across the 2 surface quite easily. They're slipping their way across. And the result, we're getting a lot of energy and the top particles being thrown over. And right at the end, we're not really getting many clumps holding on and remaining on our 2 platform. So we need to kind of increase the friction of this collision surface. So this does catch some people out, but if you have a look at our collider tag on the number 2, you'll see that the friction's on 100%. So you may be perfectly entitled to think that that's as much friction as you can have, but there is another friction value which is within the emitter. So if we go to the emitter, to the extended data tab, to the physical data, you will see, look, there is a friction setting here. And this is incredibly useful to have this additional friction setting, because what this does, this can be mapped per particle depending on other parameters. So for example, if a particle is hotter in a simulation, it will have more or less friction. If it has a greater mass, if it has a more fuel, you can change the friction amount. And so this can make simulations far more dynamic and give you a huge amount of control. But as a result, it can catch you out if you forget about it. So what it's saying is each particle will have 20% of our collider's friction value. And that's not right. Let's put it, for us, we're just going to have every particle have the same friction amount. So let's put this up to 100%, and now we can leave it. And now we can make all the adjustments on friction just using the collider tag. So now look how different this simulation is. Now we have a true 100% friction. Look, they're not moving at all underneath. So those underlying particles are pretty much almost sticking to that surface, which means we've got far less energy in the rest of this grain's sim. And they're sticking too much. We want some of that movement. So let's reduce this down somewhat. Let's put this down to, say, I don't know, let's try 70. And what we should hopefully get now is a little bit of movement of those the bottom grain's particles, and then the top ones are able to move around a little bit as well. Okay, very nice. So before we start looking at the grains settings and how we can control how many of these kind of clumps and cracks that we get, let's just make this a little bit more dynamic. And we can do that by animating the gravity, because at the moment the gravity is just switched on all of the time. But if we animate this using a fall off, we're going to get a much nicer look. So let's get that set up. We'll go to the gravity, let's go to the fall off tab, and let's bring in a box field or a box fall off, and let's just resize this a bit. So we want it to be a bit bigger. Let's increase the width, increase that fall off, and let's make it a bit taller just to be sure. And we can move it back a little bit. Okay. So what we're going to do is, what this is saying is, if the particles are within the fall off, the gravity will work. If not, it won't. So if we just bring this down to the bottom, something like that, hit play, we'll have nothing because there's no gravity in the scene now. Well, effectively no gravity because the particles aren't within it. So what we're going to do is keyframe this box field, the position. So let's go to the coordinates tab and we'll just put a keyframe on the Z. Let's go forward a few frames, maybe to frame 40. Obviously we can make adjustments with this. So we'll just move this through to, say, frame 40 approximately. And then we'll move that up. There we go. And let's put another keyframe. Let's just right click on this position node here and put animation show F curve. and you'll see that by default my settings are to have a Bezier interpolation. Don't want that, we want linear, so let's press the linear button. Okay, so now you'll see that animation is going to work differently. As the gravity passes through, it's going to have its effect on those grain particles. Very nice. So this is going to give us a more dynamic look. Excellent. Right, let's have a look at our FluidFX settings then. So we'll go to our emitter. We'll go to our Extended Data, Fluid Data tab. And there's only 3 settings, but these settings are kind of interrelated. So if you adjust one, it has a massive impact on how the other 2 will be working as well, just by the nature of solving all of these particles. So friction is simple as what you would imagine. It is the friction between grain particles. So if I put the friction down to, say, 16%, you're going to see that they're not really able to hold together in clumps. They're just kind of dropping like dry sand would, or salt or whatever. There isn't anything really keeping these together. If we increase the friction way up, it means that they're much more likely to hold together, look, and form these clumps. So that's what the friction does. And then we've got 2 other settings which will control the clumpiness and how those clumps are held together effectively. So the stability is how much the grains try and hold their original shape. If we put this stability way up, it's much harder. We're going to try really hard to keep it, and there's going to be fewer clumps. So that's on 439. If we reduce this down to, say, 5, you're going to see far more clumps as our gravity takes effect. Look, it's going to break up, and then we've got more clumps forming. And you'll note with this stability, depending on what your friction is set at, and depending on what you've got your FluidFX presets solver set at, a lot of the movement with the stability is going to take place between kind of 4 and 20. So if we put this on, well, let's put this on 2, so hardly any stability. Now we should see that we're going to get lots of very small pieces. Look, you can see that. Lots of really small pieces with little stability. We put it up to 4. It's going to change quite dramatically. It'll still have smaller ones, but not as many. Look, so now we've got bigger clumps. Okay, very cool. And then if we put it on, say, 10, now we're going to have even bigger clumps. Much bigger ones. Okay, so that is stability. And then we have cohesion. Now, cohesion's an interesting one. Cohesion, you can almost think of it as a springy constraint. It tries to hold together the chunks, and the greater the amount, it kind of it creates almost a springy, bouncy look, which for some things is very good. It's fantastic if you're kind of doing kind of jelly or some kind of soft body, but if you have too much cohesion, especially for sand, it starts to look wobbly and not realistic. So let's just demonstrate that. The lower your stability, the less likely you are to see the effects of cohesion. So let's put our stability up to, say, 20. So we'll probably only have kind of 1 or 2 big chunks here that will crack and then gradually fall apart. Yeah, look, we've got a couple, and they're gradually falling away. If I whack up cohesion to a top, you will see that it's going to try and hold these cracks, and it'll kind of stretch where they're cracked, but they won't fall apart, and you'll start to see a bounciness. You can see a bounciness just as the sim starts. Here is where it would crack normally, but look, you see it's stretching and holding it together, and it's creating this kind of stretch bounciness. So we are still losing some, but it's able to keep those clumps together. So it's making it more cohesive. So with the stability, we're still getting those kind of fracture points, but the cohesion is kind of holding them together. The downside of that is it can make things look a bit spongy and a bit bouncy. And for kind of our kind of grain sand, that isn't the look that we require. You'll also note that with cohesion, again, depending on what settings you're on, a lot of the action you're going to see from around 30 down to say 10. You're going to see big differences. Let's just keep ours on 10 for now. Let's put our stability down to say 5 and we'll hit play. And we've kind of got the look that we want here. Our gravity's animating on, which means that we're kind of getting these clumps occurring at different times. It's starting to look pretty nice. Pleased with that. All right. So what we could do at this stage is we've gone through the various different settings. What we need to do now is start going to our kind of final particle count, our final particle resolution. And then we'll start caching some tests, playing back those caches in real time to get an idea for the animation. So let's go to our emitter, to the emission tab. And at the moment, the particle count is based on this radius of 1.2. Let's put this on to say 0.9. That's 30,000 particles, so it's gone up hugely. Let's try 0.8 to see what we get from here. So 43,000 particles. So this is obviously going to run way slower, but also now we've increased the particle count, our fluid data settings are going to need to be adjusted because we've completely changed the physics of this sim now by bringing lots more particles into the equation. Look at this clumpiness now. It's looking really nice, isn't it? But can you see, look how less of an effect the stability of 5 has had. Now we've got more particles. Look, we've got far more breaking up. Arguably, they're sliding a little bit too quickly on our collider tag as well. But this is looking really nice. We're starting to get some left behind. I'm pleased with this look so far. So look, maybe we could perhaps have fewer particles sliding off by increasing. Let's just see, what did we have our collider tag friction set to? 70. Well, now we've got more particles, we need more friction. Let's maybe try that up to say 90. We'll go back to our fluid data settings. Let's have a play through. So you can see when you start getting to the final kind of render particle resolution, it starts to have a much higher impact on how quickly you can play it back. So you get to a point where you've just got to start caching and playing back those caches to get a real idea of what the simulation is going to do. So I think arguably we've got a little bit too much movement here. So let's increase our particle friction up to say, I don't know, just a little bit, up to say 80. And we could perhaps increase our cohesion a little bit so that our separate clumps aren't quite separating so quickly. Let's just have one quick playthrough with this. And we'll make that decision, and then we'll do our first cache. Looking very cool, though. I love the clumpy look, just looks fantastic. Very, very nice. Okay, so let's just do that. That's looking good, but I'm just going to increase this cohesion up to say, let's try 13%. Instead of playing through now, let's just start doing some test caches. So when I'm doing test caches, especially with fluids, it actually doesn't take an awful lot of data. What I'm going to do, let's get our cache object into the scene. We're going to cache internally just while we are doing experiments. And what do we want to cache? Well, actually, we don't need to cache all of the particle information. All we need is the velocity, the movement of the particles, and that color. So let's go to data and put custom. And you can choose now what gets cached, what data gets cached. So let's just do velocity and color, which will arguably make the cache slightly smaller. Good. And then I'm not going to compress cache on build, which will mean it'll cache more quickly. Very nice. So then I'm going to hit build cache. So I'll let this go. That was probably going to take about a minute to cache through. So I'll come back when it's done and we'll play through our sim in real time and see whether we want to make any adjustments. Okay, that was a pretty fast cache actually. Only took about 30 or 40 seconds. Let's have a look at our simulation. So looking pretty nice. It's not right yet, But we've got this. Tell you what, let's just get a Cinema 4D sky object, and we'll go to the use color on, and let's make it black. Here we go. Just gives us a better idea of how this is looking. So that's looking really nice, actually. I think the one thing we need to address is this. We've got lots of nice clumps, but the majority of them fall off and fall away. And also, we're left kind of like with quite sparsely covered bits on the number 2. So there's too much falling off here. So what we need to do is try and hold some of these clumps together. So we need bigger clumps, fewer of them, and we need them to be able to kind of stay where they are a little more on our platform. So the way I would propose to do that is this. You see that the clumps which are falling off are really stuck in these tight, rigid clumps. And that's telling me that our friction, look, watch this one. It's so tightly packed together with little movement that the whole thing shoots off. And that's telling me that the friction is a little bit too high, the particle-to-particle friction. It isn't able to kind of collapse on itself a little bit to then stay more on here. So let's make a couple of adjustments. We'll just deactivate that cache for now. So we're going to be playing this in real time. Let's go and we will reduce our friction a little bit. Now, as a result of reducing this friction, these are going to collapse on themselves a lot more quickly. But as a result of that, it's going to lose its shape a lot more quickly as well. So my guess is we're going to have much more stability. Let's have a look. So you see it's collapsing on itself more easily. But because of that, we aren't getting individual lumps flying off. There's more, look, remaining on our number 2. So let's increase that stability. So this is going to give us fewer clumps. Let's have a look. Now I have a feeling that these are going to start separating too quickly again. So if so, we can then look at the cohesion to give them more cohesive force to hold these together so they don't separate too much. But I think this is looking better without that much friction. Look, more is remaining on our number 2 platform. We're not losing as much immediately around the outsides. Let's see if we can keep a few more on here by increasing this cohesion. Let's put it up. Remember, between this amount, say 10% and 30% makes a significant difference. So let's try it up to 30 and see. In fact, look, let's put an even bigger amount. I always like to start high to see what effect it is having, and then you can always reduce it down. So let's have a look at this. So we have less friction, which means they're able to collapse on themselves a little easier. As a result, we've increased that stability, so we haven't got too many individual clumps. And now we're trying to hold these clumps together a bit more with this increased cohesion value, which means... And yeah, that's definitely having an effect. We obviously are losing some off the side. We want that, but we want some to remain on top of our platform. And I think this looks like it's done the trick now. Yes, look, I mean, we've definitely got more that has been left behind. Excellent. So that is looking really good. Let's just try a quick recache of that so we can look at that in real time, and then we can kind of make an assessment whether we're happy with that simulation settings. Then we're going to make a couple of adjustments to the color modifier, and then we'll be able to move on to the next section of this animation. So I'll just pause this here and come back when it's done. Okay, so that's finished caching, so let's have a look. And yeah, that's looking really good. Very pleased with that. We've got our clumping falling off, and then poof, we'll have our particle advection at around that time. Now, one thing to notice, because we did increase a lot of stability, can you see the elasticity and the bounce and the initial part of that sim as the particles are born? And that is just that is one of the effects of the cohesion setting. I mentioned that elasticity look earlier on. So that is, I mean, I'm happy with that. What we can do when we actually come to the rendering part is we don't need to render this part of the cache. It's settled down by this point. So what we can do is we could hold the cache on and start it on frame 9 and then just run it through once the gravity starts and we don't get that initial elasticity that was at the beginning. Let's just try one more cache. I'm thinking if I slightly reduce the cohesion at this stage, we might be able to maintain a little bit more of a kind of an edge on here. You see, it's all kind of melded and smoothed. Let's just try one more. But to be honest, once we put lights in and we've got shadows acting, real shadows, not just this fake ambient occlusion, this will be less or even not an issue. But let's just see what difference it makes while we're making these adjustments to have a go at that. So let's take the cache off, remember, so we can look what's happening. And let's put this cohesion down to, say, 30, and I'm particularly interested when we get round to those final frames. So look, we've got much less of a bounce already with a cohesion of 30. In fact, there was no discernible bounce at the beginning. Let's see if we've got enough cohesion to hold these together a little as they're crumbling though. So now they're falling down. We've got these that are remaining on our platform, which look nice. This is the bottom of the two here. This area is looking nice. What we don't want is to lose too much of this before the advection starts. Otherwise, the two will be a bit sparse. But this is looking nice. We've got a lot of clumps here. And I'm saying that by this point, this is when we're going to advect. So I think that's good, and we've got that cohesion down to 30%. As a result, there's that less elasticity, there's less of a bounce, there's no real discernible bounce. That is a good setting. Excellent. Okay, so I'm not actually going to cache at this point just yet because we're not ready to do that. What I'm going to do, just to be sure, is I'm going to delete this test cache object. I'm going to delete this test cache tag, just so we don't make any mistakes further down the line. And what we are going to do is, before we can kind of incrementally save this one up, instead of this being from blue to white, what I would like to do is actually have this color just from black to white. And the reason is we're actually going to assign the color at the render stage, but we want to bake in this color information into the particles into kind of particle color value, black to white, which we can then map later on in the rendering stage. So let's just make a couple of changes. We can get rid of that one, get rid of that one, and this black one, let's just turn it to black. Okay, and now we've got our black to white particle gradient. All right. And if we play this through here, the cracks will start to look really nice with this type of colouring, because obviously as they crack, the white particles are revealed underneath the kind of black to grey to white. Doesn't that look fantastic? Love it. What a good look. Excellent. Okay, so let's incrementally save there, because that's looking really nice. So let's save incremental. And what I'm going to do at this stage is we are going to take our XP system, and let's rename this. We're going to call this XP System Grains. And then we will just hit save there. And that is the first section of this big technical scene finished. Now we need to move on and set up the advection of those sand particles.